So welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining this important panel discussion on inclusive growth from frameworks to action. My name is Marie Lanfrendo. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Infrastructure Hub, and I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar in partnership with Jacobs. Together, we've lined up a panel of speakers from around the world for a discussion that aims to inspire leadership and help move from conceptual approaches to systematic and repeatable actions that can be implemented now. A warm thank you to today's panelists. So let me introduce them. First, we will have Jonathan Weiner of Sidewalk Labs, also Uma Udasamali of Mumbai Metropolitan Regional Development Authority, Mohammed Maher Manai of the Islamic Development Bank, and Emily King and Sarah Alexander of Jacobs. Before we dive into our topic today, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you shortly to the Global Infrastructure Hub and our work for those that are unfamiliar with us. So the GI Hub is the G20's dedicated infrastructure entity and supports the G20 to drive an ambitious agenda on sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure. So from our offices in Sydney, Australia, where I'm talking to you tonight, and Toronto in Canada, the GI Hub team provides data, insights, and best practice, working to create partnerships and collaboration across the industry and public and private sector. Infrastructure will be a major priority in the context of COVID-19 recovery at the G20. Starting last year under the Saudi presidency, and this year with the Italian presidency, it's focusing their infrastructure agenda on action to ensure a return to a strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. This transformative infrastructure agenda, as we call it, is structured around 4 areas. First, resilience and maintenance. The second is digital infrastructure. The third one is sustainable infrastructure. And the fourth one is social inclusion. We are very pleased to be supporting the G20 Italian presidency through our work on transformative infrastructure. And let me give you a couple of examples. The first one is a digital tool that we call the Infra Tracker that will offer access to more data to make informed decisions when it comes to using infrastructure for economic recovery post-COVID. We are currently in the process of developing this tool, and it will be delivered to the G20 and available on the GI Hub website in the upcoming month. Social value and inclusion are key elements to achieving this transformation for infrastructure, as I spoke about earlier. And each country is unique in what inclusive opportunities they focus on. And it will really depend on their individual strength as a country. That's why, as the Global Hub tasked with providing resources and fostering connections across the industry, we have done and will continue to do quite a bit of work in this area. For example, we are currently compiling a list of transformative infrastructure frameworks and project delivery case studies that will allow countries to identify leading practices and innovation that can enable better implementation of social value into infrastructure projects. This work is focused around an outcomes approach, looking really beyond the cost. In 2019, also, the GI Hub published a guidance on inclusive infrastructure and social equity that presents a practical evidence-based framework for practitioners to maximize the impact of infrastructure investment on reducing inequality and promoting shared prosperity. The conclusion of this report were slightly worrying because the development and the area of inclusive infrastructure is very scattered across project sectors and geography and would benefit from one end from better targeted policies and incentives by governments, and on the other end from the private sector expertise to bring some practical and innovative solutions. So this starts with raising awareness and sharing those best practices. So to that end, we continue also to support the G20's efforts to advance work related to the G20 Principles for Quality Infrastructure Investment, which is, if you want, the G20 proxy for SDGs. And our current work includes a member-led survey on the G20 Quality Infrastructure Investment Principle, which aims to facilitate the compilation of good practices provide analysis to highlight where more progress could be made, and help inform the important work on QI indicators to start measuring our progress. This particular report I will actually present it to the finance ministers in April. But raising awareness is necessary, but not sufficient. And I really look forward to hearing the practical solution our panelists will discuss today. And if COVID-19 has showed us anything, is that we should care more, and that empathy, consideration for our communities should be core to any project. And this is the move from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism that we see happening right now. And infrastructure has a key role to play in enabling this needed transformation for our society. So let me stop here and let me now introduce Patrick Hill, the Executive Vice President from Jacobs, that will share with us his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marie, and thank you to you in your capacity as the CEO of the Global Infrastructure Hub for hosting this very important webinar on what's a very important topic. And it will be increasingly important to help our economies and our local communities to recover from the impacts of the global pandemic that you mentioned. The Global Infrastructure Hub plays a vital leadership role in promoting, educating, and equipping decision makers to create as much economic, social, and environmental value as possible from infrastructure. And we're really pleased to be a part of this conversation. We know the scale and scope of the challenge is large. In recent years, the global infrastructure deficit has increased despite a significant need for infrastructure and a record level of funding waiting to be invested. As we face some of humanity's biggest challenges in living memory, the world has a unique opportunity to boldly invest in infrastructure to secure our future. And the conversation starts with examining how infrastructure was planned in the past and positively challenging what infrastructure can do for our communities in the future. At Jacobs, this is the heart of what we do. We challenge today to reinvent tomorrow. As a company, we've been exploring how infrastructure can be conceived, planned, delivered, and maintained to generate enduring social value, helping to address and overcome some of the most entrenched social issues in our communities, such as reliable and affordable access to essential education, food, health, and utility services, and creating meaningful employment opportunities for our most vulnerable communities. We've been really pleased to see the important movement on this topic, even in recent weeks. For example, the new administration in the US has taken significant strides to address inclusion. And we're also seeing the levelling up agenda in the UK making some moves there. In the private sector, inclusion and climate are also key messages in BlackRock CEO Larry Fink's recent 2021 letter to business leaders. Of course, this is just the tip of the iceberg for what needs to be done, but it's encouraging to see the positive indicators of progress to come. Working closely with governments, owner clients, and partners around the globe to help them understand how to use infrastructure investment to improve people's lives beyond traditional economic measures is a big part of what we do at Jacobs. There are a couple of examples that I'd like to share with you. One of them was with Edinburgh City, where we work closely with partners and the council to reimagine their central business district to make it more accessible and relevant to the wider community, not simply for those that just work in the city. Similarly, in India, our team have helped develop and plan and design new precincts where local communities and businesses have partnered in providing services to new types of businesses attracted to these new precincts. Which brings us to today's panel and the challenge of creating thoughtful and quality infrastructure that promotes social value, economic growth, and most importantly, is inclusive for all. So thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your experiences to come. It'll be a truly global set of insights, which we're all looking forward to. On behalf of everyone here at Jacobs and at the Global Infrastructure Hub, we extend a warm welcome to all of today's participants. In handing back to you, Monica, I'd just like to say how much I'm looking forward to today's discussion and collectively challenging ourselves to do more. Over to you, Monica.
You are muted, Monica.
Of course, that has to happen every single time. Thank you, Patrick. I'll say it again. Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Marie, for providing us the context around our webinar today. I'm Monica Bennett. I'm the Director of Thought Leadership for the Global Infrastructure Hub, and I'll be the moderator for the panel discussion today, where we'll be addressing the question, what will it take for infrastructure to deliver inclusive growth? So I guess, what do we mean by this exactly? So while we often assume that infrastructure investment will trigger economic growth and that this will benefit everyone equally, these economic benefits of infrastructure are well recognized, but what's less recognized is that infrastructure may deliver negative social impacts if different groups of people are unintentionally excluded. So if their needs and livelihoods are not taken into account during the planning and delivery stages of infrastructure projects. So this is an area where there's been a substantial amount of work, across both the GI Hub and Jacobs as well. So for example, Marie's mentioned our inclusive infrastructure tool and the work that we're doing around transformative infrastructure as well. And likewise, Jacobs Social Value Blueprint provides a framework for incorporating social value across the infrastructure project lifecycle. And so with this as a great baseline for delving into this topic, the next step in this journey is really, how can we deliver against these objectives? And this is what we'll be covering during our panel discussion today. So our panelists will be talking about practical, tried and tested frameworks and solutions that they've adopted in the past. And we'll also hear from some of their lessons learned along the way. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel, and I know Marie's already mentioned who our panel is going to be, but when I introduce you, maybe you can give a little wave so that everyone knows where you are on the screen. So our first panelist is Uma Udusumali, who's the Chief of the Planning Division for the Mumbai Metropolitan Regional Development Authority. We have Meher Manai, the Head of Financial Institutions Program at the Islamic Development Bank. Emily King, Senior Lead for Social Value at Jacobs. Jonathan Weiner, the CEO for Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners. And Sarah Alexander, Principal Consultant for Social Investment and Innovation at Jacobs. So we'll delve straight into the questions. And our first question is for you, Uma. Uma, can you tell us a little bit about your institution, the MMRDA, and your strategy for delivering social value through infrastructure and the systemic changes being made to enable inclusivity?
Thank you, Monica. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, I represent an institution that is a regional planning and development authority, which is a parastatal owned by the provincial government of Maharashtra in India. And we operate from Mumbai, and our operational jurisdiction is Mumbai Metropolitan Region. As you all know, New Delhi is the capital of India, but Mumbai is the financial capital of India. This is where all the wealth is sitting and transacted from. So it's a very large urban region, and it has 22.8 million people living here in 2011. Count of population in 2021 is delayed on account of COVID. So we should be close to maybe 25 or 26 million people today. And we have a large number of cities, many million plus cities, and a large number of villages clustered together as a metropolitan region. So it's very important for us to reach out through transportation networks to all these areas, and so that the jobs and other activities and housing facilities can be complemented across the region. So I am today talking about the transportation projects that have resulted in a lot of social outcomes. That's one aspect I'm going to concentrate on. There are land use, there are economic developments and other things, but I'm concentrating on this so that I can touch upon several aspects of interest to this subject. We are at the moment building road and rail, that is metro projects worth about 21 billion US dollars. That's my office alone, coupled with other agencies in the region that are also investing in transport infrastructure. It could be upwards of 30 billion US dollars. of investment that is being spent at the moment and will be spent in the next 5 years. A lot of them are in progress. So we are building at the moment 130 plus kilometers of metro lines and a large number of bridges, tunnels, lot of sea bridges. The longest sea bridge of India is under construction by my office at the moment, 22 kilometers long one. So that's the generic part of it. But what is interesting to know is that through the transport infrastructure, we are trying to address the issues concerning land uses that are not so well integrated and the population distribution in a very balanced manner across the region that can be ensured through transportation, and to improve economic opportunities to people by improving their mobility across the region, and also creating a lot of livelihoods and employment opportunities. And I am looking at employment opportunities and livelihoods in slightly different manner. The employment opportunities are being created by way of large number of projects that are happening, and each of them is actually creating a large pool of construction and other skilled and semi-skilled and unskilled for these people and unskilled people. At the moment, these projects are employing 125,000 labor of all kinds, actively, gainfully employed. And because these are specialized projects, their skills are getting automatically upgraded with or without academic kind of training courses. So there are a large number of metros under construction in India. So the labor that is employed here is becoming so highly skilled that they will be greatly in demand in other cities and other parts of the country as well. So their mobility in pursuit of employment opportunities and better economic status is also improving with this. And even during COVID time, a large number of them stayed back because of the kind of committed efforts that happened at each of these labor sites where housing was already created on a temporary basis. They remained in the shelter with the assurance that a part of their wages will continue to be paid while they sat through the lockdown period. And their health and welfare was monitored and provided for through a pool of people who were working for the contractors, paid by the client agency, that's mine. And regular medical checkups were conducted. And because of these measures, a part of the wages was also paid and food was provided independent of the wages. And because of these measures, a large number of them stayed back, but some of them did leave. And during the lockdown process, with government's support, the works actually started, and they went at such a tremendous speed because there was no obstruction to the works happening. The works could happen throughout the day. And those who left wanted to come back after the lockdown was going to be lifted. So the office, with the help of Ministry of Railways, actually provided trains for them to come back from various parts of the country, so that they can once again be gainfully employed here. So that's one part of it. And secondly, through the large number of infrastructure projects that we are building, we are anticipating that a number of outcomes would be there. At the moment, complete the projects, and we are yet to measure some of these outcomes. So, but we'll have a good benchmark against the anticipation that we are putting on record at the moment. And those are in terms of creating alternatives to people, choices to people in terms of their mode of transport, in terms of cost of transport, and also in terms of time that it takes for them to travel from one place to the other, particularly for employment. And the large number of new opportunities in transport sector are also going to offer people housing mobility. If they can't afford a house in the city of Mumbai, they could now, they can consider moving to the next city where housing is cheaply available, and the more modal opportunities of transportation might still make it possible for them to come back to the same employment or look at other employment. The second thing is the large number of infrastructure projects are also in the greenfield kind of environment. On slums and squatter settlements, they are passing through them, and a large number of these settlements are being rehabilitated if possible, within the remaining part of the same land parcel, and where it is impossible to rehouse them in the same area, they're being shifted to the nearby sites. Nearby is at a site where it's technically possible to relocate. Through these measures, the slums and squat settlements are also getting upgraded into formal housing stock, and people are able to move from informal sector settlements into formal sector settlements. A lot by the regulations. Yeah, Monica?
Yeah, no, I was just saying that you're sometimes cutting in and out, just so that you're aware.
Oh, okay. Maybe my network has some issue. I'm sorry
Yes.
about it.
You can try maybe turn off your video and you might have a better connection.
Okay, let me try that. Thank you. So when we say that the projects around the infrastructure sector are inclusive, I think what we mean is that they're inclusive in terms of the kind of competing land demands that they are trying to address by connecting them well. And we also mean in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of creation of new economic opportunities and employment opportunities. And when I said livelihoods, I meant when large number of settlements are rehabilitated in the new rehabilitated area on account of loss of livelihoods that happened through shifting or by cutting across their areas. The new livelihood opportunities are being encouraged and created actively in the newly rehabilitated areas. And cooperatives are being created, and the institutional support is being extended to create spaces for new employment opportunities, and hand-holding is happening to create, to kind of integrate them into the new livelihoods that are being created. And also large number of social infrastructure is being created, which might or might not have been available in the slum pockets where people were living earlier. So there are a lot of additional outcomes out of these infrastructure projects, but there are certain issues related to these, the large amount of investment that is needed. These are cost incentive, intensive, as well as labor intensive. So that itself is throwing up certain issues because they are also long-term projects, and the continuity of funding for these projects and the continuity of assurances for labor, employment and livelihood creation and housing, rehousing kind of opportunities need to be really addressed. So far, we don't see great problem in any of these. So I think the social values that are coming out of these projects are through better travel conditions. The suburban trains of Mumbai were legendary. They're the largest suburban network probably in Asia. But the travel conditions within those trains was extreme. So there were, at an estimate, there were about 16 people traveling per square meter of the gangways in the trains, which is impossible to even imagine. So the kind of crowding that would create and environmental conditions that would create is something that we are trying to ease by providing modal choices to people. It's not that Mumbai will be catering to more number of travelers in future. The incremental addition of more people traveling is marginal compared to the improved travel conditions within each of these modes that is available today in a bus and in a train and in metro, etc. The second thing is the housing mobility that is being offered, and the employment mobility that it is offering. And to make the whole experience of traveling through these new modes pleasant, a number of allied activities are being planned, which will also improve basic living conditions for the settlements around the railway stations. They include multimodal integration kind of projects and creating pedestrian movement facilities. This is particularly important for the context of Mumbai region because in the non-motorized, if we consider both motorized and non-motorized trips that are happening in the region, about more than 40% of the trips are happening by exclusive walk trips. So it's very important for us to address the pedestrian movements and the safe travel for them on the sidewalks. And the second thing is of the motorized transport, about 80% is happening through public transport, both rail and bus. And the rail component is 70 out of the 80. So it is also very important that when we get down from a railway, from a train, the conditions immediately outside the railway stations are conducive for us to reach our homes, our place of employment. So the last mile connectivity is extremely crucial. So projects under the banner of multimodal integration are including aspects like redesigning the streets close to the railway stations and the footpaths and pedestrian accesses, signages, toilets, and the drainage, and all these systems are being improved around the railway stations. And also the local travel modes, the last mile connectivity modes are the new modes are introduced, being considered and being introduced over and beyond the bus network that we have today. And the bus companies are also planning to operate new systems of buses, more environment friendly and easy to board and alight kind of systems are being put in place. I think I should be exceeding my time now. Monica, if that's okay, I would like
to... that was incredibly interesting, and I think later on in the panel, in the moderated panel discussion after the short presentations, we'll be talking a little bit more about how you've helped to influence some of those decisions around those projects as well. So so that's certainly an interesting conversation for a little bit later. But now we'll move on to Meher. So Meher, you're coming at this from a different angle. So not in terms of investment into infrastructure, but in terms of investments, to achieve social value nonetheless. So our question for you is, what are the Islamic Development Bank's objectives under its Economic Empowerment Fund, and how has it been designed to achieve these kinds of social outcomes?
Thank you very much, Monica. So this is Mohammed Maher Mannai. I'm the head of Economic Empowerment Financial Institutions and Impact Funds within the Economic Empowerment Department. The Economic Empowerment Department was launched based on a long assessment of our experience along more than 40 years in impact investment and lesson learned from all our interventions. The mandate of this department is to mainstream the economic empowerment approach. This approach aims to provide opportunities to the economically excluded segments of society in our member countries, with special focus on MSMEs. It's a paradigm shift from financial inclusion to economic inclusion by building a sustainable ecosystem in collaboration with the development partners around the end users for its economic inclusion in the long term, while of course positioning the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, agenda at the heart of our interventions, namely the SDG 1, end of poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, SDG 5, gender equality, SDG 8, economic development and decent jobs, SDG 10, reduce inequality, and finally SDG 17, partnerships. Our top priorities include poverty alleviation, enhanced food security, and reduced inequality, with a special attention given to the needs of disadvantaged women and youth in our member countries. The overreaching goal of our program is to change the mindset of beneficiaries from being recipients of aid to real business partners. Really, it's the restore of dignity of our people in our member countries. And later on, I will try, to provide you with the concrete example. So our main target is really to empower more than 10 million people in all our member countries, with target of funds around 3 billion in the next 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Meher. And you're keen to hear a little bit more around, that shift in mindset on going from receiving aid to being business partners. That's a very interesting design concept. So our next question is for you, Emily. So I guess, following on from, what Meher and what Uma have been talking about, how would you, or, how have you, through Jacobs, use social value measurement to drive more equitable outcomes from infrastructure investment? And I guess touching on, some of the elements of what Meher has just said as well, can you provide, a comment on your experience using SDGs as a measure of outcomes?
Yeah, thanks, Monica. So as a social value practitioner, I can definitely see how social value measurement can be used as a really effective tool when it comes to delivering equitable outcomes. And I think the direction of travel for us is all about using these tools strategically, ideally at the outset of projects. So when we're planning and designing our infrastructure projects, we're going through option selection and making these key decisions, that we're really keeping in mind, how are we going to deliver a legacy for our communities, and using social value measurement as a mechanism to drive that. So we partner with Symmetrica Jacobs, who are global leaders in social value measurement and have vast experience of evaluating all outcomes that have a potential bearing on social value. And what we look at is well-being and quality of life. So these concepts of well-being and quality of life are becoming increasingly prominent and used in our appraisal. So in the UK, we have the Green Book, which is our UK government appraisal guidance. And we work on a basic premise that whatever has value for society is anything that improves well-being and quality of life overall. So to achieve this, we've got various techniques. So we can draw on traditional economic techniques such as cost-benefit analysis, multi-criteria analysis, social return on investment, and then we have other tools available to us, such as like other sort of non-financial approaches where we can use stated preference and revealed preference, which are methods that rely on bespoke surveys. And then we also have techniques like subjective well-being, where we make use of national well-being data. So there's various papers available authored by Jacobs in partnership with Symmetrica Jacobs that provide a lot of detail about these methodologies, and I can share those with the group. And I think one technique in particular that we use to drive more equitable outcomes is looking at how societal benefits and disbenefits are spatially distributed. So we have a technique called distributional impact appraisal, and this is a well-established technique in the UK, and traditionally it's concerned with whether social groups could be unfairly disadvantaged or advantaged, if you're looking at high income groups, by economic and social impacts such as accessibility to employment and accessibility to social infrastructure like schools, for example. So we've really recently started to deepen and expand our approaches to distributional impacts by bringing in social value techniques, and in particular we use quality of life diagnostics and welfare weights. So I'll just give you a brief overview of these two concepts. So with the quality of life diagnostics, this is really all about doing detailed desk-based analysis, generating statistical profiles of the communities that we're affecting with these projects. And then we can map this data spatially using the most granular data that is available to us using GIS and other digital platforms. And mapping the spatial impacts in that way and the spatial demographic data, it allows us to pinpoint where there's high levels of inequality, and we can look at where there are patterns of deprivation within and between communities. And this approach and this diagnostics, it gives us really important information on what levers we might want to pull and manipulate to drive better outcomes for the communities that we're looking at. So then on welfare weights, so we apply a weighting approach, and this is it's based on the premise that £100 or €100 or $100 is worth more to a person on a low income than it would be to a wealthy person. So what we do by applying these weights is we adjust the benefits according to the marginal value of money for those that are actually receiving the benefits. And what we find is that what we can do is make sure that our projects get full credit for the contribution that they're making to reducing inequality and promoting growth in deprived areas. And what we're doing in effect is providing information to help inform those decisions as to how projects will go ahead. We also have equity weights. Again, this is a sort of complementary tool to the welfare weights, and this is more about capturing the level of preference of the general public for equality and focusing benefits on those that are the least well off. So there are various social value measurement techniques available to us that can drive equitable outcomes, and we're always keeping in mind that ultimate aim of lasting legacy. So then on the second point, Monica, around SDGs. So the SDGs are very much, a very powerful set of metrics that are relevant to quality of life and relevant to social value. I think in our experience of how we're working on a project and program basis, we perhaps want to incorporate concerns sometimes that aren't explicitly covered by the SDGs. So although it's a great overarching framework, quite often we want more granular metrics that can be applied at the project and program level that really help us drill down into how we can influence what's happening within communities and where we might want to look at specific and unique impacts to that project, be it changes to cultural heritage assets, or perhaps looking at the specific impacts of improving community connectivity between different cities and employment hubs. Just to briefly touch on a tool that we use, which is the Social Value Bank, which is a suite of metrics and associated values that we can use for monitoring and reporting. We can use it for supply chain management, environmental management, and this is like a user-friendly online tool that we have compliant with the relevant guidance in the UK and the OECD guidelines. In terms of the SDGs, we've through an innovation initiative within Jacobs, we've designed a tool called Evolve, which again we can share some information about. And this is again a user-friendly interface where you can evaluate the performance of your projects against the goals, and the tool will provide you with suggestions of commitments or indicators that you might want to adopt to better align with the goals and to drive performance. So there's definitely potential for us to look at this Evolve tool, look at the social value bank that we have, and align those so that we can start to really capture the total value and track that over time.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Some really interesting points there. And I guess we're going to go, along a parallel track, still on the topic of, measuring outcomes. So, Jonathan, technology is an enabler for so many quality infrastructure outcomes, social value being one. And I guess if we're following on from Emily's point on measurement and the importance in driving equitable outcomes, how can technology be used to better predict and measure these social outcomes? And can you provide a few examples where technology has enabled this to happen, and what some of the lessons have been from your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Very briefly, Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, my company, we invest in technology-enabled infrastructure. We're backed by Alphabet, Google's parent company, and the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. And so, our mandate, our entire mandate is how can you use technology to build more sustainable, more resilient, and more inclusive infrastructure? And so early on, we sort of had to ask the question, like, if that's our mandate and that's what we're trying to achieve, how are you going to measure that, right? How are you going to report out on whether or not you've achieved your metric? And we adopted a framework that's loosely based on a framework that the Los Angeles Metro uses here in the United States. And one of the things that they really we're thought leaders in that we think is really insightful, is that very early on in the process of designing an infrastructure system, long before procurement or construction or you get down that path, it's very, very important to talk both to the municipalities, the sponsors of the project itself, and to the communities it's going to serve, and to come up with quantitative metrics of what you're trying to achieve. And there are some metrics, we just heard from Emily a number of good sort of macro metrics, but in each project there are very specific, almost project related metrics that you can identify, often cases using technology, because if you can't identify what you're trying to achieve, it's very hard to optimize the system that you're designing and building to sort of achieve the outcome. And so maybe to make that a little more concrete, I can walk through a few examples, and I think in each case technology has played a really key role. Maybe I can talk first on the mobility side. We heard a little bit about the massive mobility investments in India. About 18 months ago, we started working on a mobility project in the state of Michigan here in the United States. The goal was to connect Detroit and Ann Arbor, which are two major population centers within Michigan, and also two major employment centers. And the real challenge that was being faced there was there were a number of communities along that corridor that in the United States had been declared economic opportunity zones. Effectively, they were underserved communities that had become lower income because they didn't have access to the population centers in the two major cities. And so the question, from the project sponsor's perspective, in this case, the state of Michigan and their Department of Transportation, was how can we better serve those communities? And that was really the point of the project. And of course, there were a number of different ways you could add transit along this corridor. You could do a light rail, you could do a bus rapid transit system, you could do any number of sort of approaches. And so we really needed to quantify what it would mean to better serve these communities. We used a technique called synthetic population modeling, which uses a bunch of pairs data about how people flow and move through a particular corridor, and figured out that one of the real challenges was the total amount of time it took for somebody living in one of these communities to actually get to one of the job centers. And that was often the case because they had to take like 3 different types of public transit, and the connectivity between the 3 of them would cause their wait to be longer. And so that's what we set out as our metric. How many seats of public transit per hour we're going to be able to deliver during peak times, and what the time savings would be relative to sort of the status quo. And so one of the things that emerged as we started designing the systems, that was like very early in our consultation, like pre-development phase with the community. One of the things that we realized pretty early on was that ride sharing with smaller form factor vehicles, where you'd be able to group people by destination, would be far more effective than other types of public transit, like a light rail. We get enough throughput through in terms of the number of seats, and that involved having a dedicated right of way for these vehicles. But also by grouping people by destination, you had to make fewer stops, and you could actually go into the communities rather than just staying on the highway, which is the major corridor. The last mile problem had been a real challenge for those communities. Ultimately, that led to a project that we announced last year in partnership with the DOT there, which is North America's first dedicated right of way for autonomous vehicles. And I think what's really interesting about that is what enabled that project to be economic is being able to provide that public transit service using these vehicles in this corridor. So that's one quick example. I'll briefly mention a couple others outside of mobility. We for the last year we've been focused on the energy crisis in California. For those of you who might not be aware, the last 2 summers in California there have been significant blackouts in the energy grid, where peak demand in the summer has gotten too high. We had this idea of developing a virtual power plant to try and address that. That is, rather than building more generation, to try and put smart devices into buildings and put in this case residences that would allow those residences to shift their energy usage during the peak times in the summer to allow the grid to be more resilient. The question then from an inclusion point of view, though, was sort of how do you do that, and what are some of the metrics that you want to set up front beyond just the climate metrics that you're trying to achieve, megawatt hours saved and thermal power avoided. So for us, what we really wanted to focus on was how big an impact could this virtual power plant have on populations where their energy bill, the amount they were spending on a monthly basis for energy, was a certain percentage of their overall income. And we said, how can we get that community to partner with us to address this challenge in California? And so in that case, we're doing it by zip code. So zip code by zip code, we are targeting using social media people who want to be a part of this virtual power plant. We are paying for our capital investment, are the devices to make their homes more responsive to the grid, and those communities get paid once they put the devices into their home. It's optional, they opt in, but if they get an alert and they opt in, they're able to shift their power usage, and they save money on their energy bill. So both addressing the climate need and the energy grid challenge in California, but also making sure that the communities would benefit from it, and choosing which communities very intentionally from from an inclusive perspective. And then lastly, very briefly, and we had this one still sort of in progress, as opposed to the other two, but we've been focused a lot, particularly with COVID, on the digital divide and what that means for school districts. And there are a number of school districts in America, I think, as a result of COVID, who have prioritized how they can get ubiquitous broadband connectivity to all their students so they can participate in online classes. We're working with a municipality right now, it's still in the early stages, but we're working with a municipality right now who had this idea that they wanted to sponsor a network for the students in their community. The real challenge with that, I think, was an economic one initially. How are we going to be able to provide a wireless network that ubiquitously covers, everybody in our community without spending tens of millions of dollars that we as a school district don't have? And so, we partnered with them, and the other question was going to be, how can we bring down the cost per student, and how many students are coming online? But for each one that we bring online, how can we bring down the cost per student that we're providing new broadband to? And the solution we came to there was actually to use spectrum sharing to create a new type of what's called a neutral host broadband network, which allows multiple different people to use it. You can have revenue generation, but you can also provide key services to a community using something called network splicing. But again, that technology solution, right? Like the fact that we chose to use that particular hardware kit and we chose to use slicing as how we deliver that network, was really driven by that question of how can you bring down the cost per student of bringing a new student online in this community. So again, I'd love to say that there's an easy overarching metric and all these, you just measure this, but really what it is creating a framework where early on in the process, you understand the constituency, you understand the users of your infrastructure system, you create metrics in partnership with them about what you want to be able to deliver. And then it gives you the freedom and the creativity to then say, well, here are the sets of innovations we can use to make sure we optimize for that particular outcome.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. And I think that's a really great segue to Sarah's part of the presentation, which is talking about the key enablers that bring it all together. So as you mentioned, that there's lots of different elements to ensuring that we're creating social value. So Sarah, based on some of the work that you've done within Jacobs, what are those key enablers that brings everything together? And also, is there something, I guess, within that framework that can be accelerated and implemented now to be able to contribute towards our economic recovery post-COVID?
Yeah, so in terms of enablers, there's really two that we've been observing over the last 12 months, both of which have been highlighted by tonight's panelists. The first is very practical, and that is that we actually do now have access to data and platforms that helps us really quickly include typically and traditionally sort of excluded groups and weigh up different investment decisions and design choices in a way that considers a much, much wider range of criteria that includes these social outcomes. This used to fall in the too hard basket or become a very qualitative versus quantitative type debate, but the data and methodologies are there, and the cost and time frame associated with these is a lot more manageable than it used to be. Of course, they're not perfect, but they will be made more robust and further refined the more that we use them, just as other assessment methodologies have evolved over the years. But really the first step there is sort of working with decision makers to think big and act small. So what this looks like is not trying to overhaul all of our current decision-making processes at once, but to start with incorporating at least a couple of key values and metrics that are really sort of key to the narrative of your project, but often not particularly well captured. So that could be a shift to more meaningful employment, access to quality public open space, or a greater sense of belonging and safety and community resulting from the project, but just starting with at least a couple of them to test it out with different stakeholders and communities and so on. The second enabler is much harder to really bottle and roll out, and that is diversity and meaningful collaboration, both within a team and across different partner types. So what we found is that the more diverse in terms of lived experience, discipline, sector, role, and so on, the more organically all of these components come together and actually make sense. So this might mean rather than trying to keep the entrepreneurs and the activists on the outside for as long as possible, actually bring them in really early as part of your planning or design team. And that true collaboration takes time to get started, which can sometimes grate against the pressure to really get things approved and shovel ready. But taking that extra moment is what ultimately doesn't really let anyone off the hook, keeps everyone honest in terms of it not becoming tokenistic sort of social value. So as an example, sort of one project we started with the social value metrics, which were introduced by economists. Our First Nations owned social enterprise partner really challenged aspects in the approach to these metrics and ended up doing some additional work, which in partnership, which led to more robust values, plus greater social procurement outcomes. And this then in turn led to interest from impact investors who could see genuine intent around both the social and the commercial aspects. And we also had digital advisors and a sort of urban tech startup providing ideas around how you could track and attribute these changes over time. So all those pieces really, really complement each other if you get them all working and all the right players in the room at the right time. As for accelerating this under COVID economic recovery, absolutely, we have a window where business as usual just won't cut it. And instead we need new models that simultaneously address environmental, health, social, and economic crises. So when you start to line up some of these new approaches and models with infrastructure investment and spending, which is obviously big under COVID recovery plans, there's a huge opportunity to be tested and actually create the new economy. Oh, you're on mute, Monica.
Yes. For the next part of the panel discussion, we'll be having a more interactive discussion within the panel. And I guess before we start that, I just want to remind the audience to please post any questions that you might have to the audience. And while we're having a chat, you can think about what your questions are, and we will come to them shortly. So I guess just going back, Uma, to what you were saying earlier about all of the various projects that you're working on, and the diversity, I guess, in the different types of projects and different kinds of outcomes that you were looking to achieve. What do you feel was the most effective way to influence decision makers to actually adopt those projects and invest in those projects? Did you experience any challenges along the way, and how did you go about resolving those challenges?
There were some challenges. I am a technocrat, so we have our own perspective on what is actually a challenge. So there were three challenges that I personally found. One is that I am an urban planner. We would expect anything to happen in a particular sequence. There should be a policy, a program, a plan, and then a project, and then so on and so forth. But then a lot of times we see that decisions are exactly in reverse of this, retrofitted to policy and planning frameworks later, or somewhere in between. So that's one challenge I see. So even though there are a lot of projects happening in my own region, and they all have certain outcomes, they may be even achieved, but whether they have the expected impact on other sectors of development and other aspects of development is something that we will have to wait and watch. If only they were a bit more sequentially arranged and integrated in a harmonious fashion when they emanated, probably the results would be even more successful or more successful. That's one thing. And secondly, we have these mega projects happening in our region. So everything goes in a very large scale. So I have a personal fear that if they fail, they all fail together. So the times of introducing a project or a concept or a new policy, testing it against all odds in a specific context, and then reconciling that into by multiplying it, those days seems to be gone. So now these are, they're all bundled together. So I have this little fear that they might not address the issues that come up along their way. So that's one. And then a lot of times I also see that institutions like mine and others, even I was part of that kind of apprehension in the past, that we play multiple roles. We are a planning authority, we are a project implementing authority, we are also a regulating authority, we are also a funding agency. We provide those immense amount of urban local bodies within our region and other infrastructure agencies. So channelize funds of other agencies. So when we play all these roles, I used to always be under the impression that there are conflicting interests, even though we are a public body. So, but then subsequently, I realized that rather than seeing them as conflicting roles, one can also see them as spectrum of powers available to a single institution, which can actually profess a policy and demonstrate through projects that it works. So that's one apprehension I had, but then I learned later on that it could be used in a very beneficial way. That's it.
Thank you, Uma. And I guess similar question to you, Meher. You know, coming from a different perspective, I guess, in terms of being able to facilitate more investments into, you know, some of these opportunities that you're looking at to the Economic Empowerment Fund. You know, what do you feel is the best way to influence investors to invest into social outcomes?
I mean, thank you very much. I mean, in all our interventions, especially in dealing with the governments, our main partners, being a development bank, so our main partner is the government, and the governments in general. I mean, those are their goals, the SDGs and the social development, they are really their goals, and we are there really to help them to achieve those goals. So in all our intervention, as I mentioned, in our intervention, always it's under an umbrella of program where we have different components. So the social development SDGs are part of the expected results in all our interventions. So there is what we call, eligibility criteria and expected results, so that we need to sign together, us and the government and our partners, to achieve those goals. Because really, I mean, without financial inclusion and inclusive growth and social development, you cannot sustain your business at the end of the day. So nowadays, it's not just a matter of pumping money and throwing investment. Really, you need to care about the end results from the social development perspective.
Okay, and to you, Jonathan, when you mentioned about meeting with stakeholders early on to be able to quantify what some of the benefits might be, what are some positive or negative experience that you can share around that in terms of that as being a driver for projects moving forward?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where when you raise the subject early on with stakeholders, there's sort of unanimous interest. Like, yes, that we care very much about holistically understanding the social value of this project, and we want to work with you in coming up with those metrics. It gets harder in practice, right? The second meeting is always harder than the first meeting because lots of different people translate that into lots of different things, and there are some things we can measure and there are some things we can't measure, and so it becomes a process. I think. One of the ideas, one of the policy ideas that I've heard recently in the United States, which I don't know if it will become policy in the US, but I think it's being discussed, is we have environmental impact assessments that are highly regulated, and the process by which one goes through an environmental impact assessment has been well defined over several decades. I imagine there are similar regulations in other markets as well. And so the idea of expanding that process to specifically include impacts beyond environmental impacts, but social impact as well. I think that would actually be very helpful because it would create sort of a more formalized process by which one arrives at consensus on these issues, and potentially even sort of bodies that can help support that process. But it's early days, right? I mean, I think one of the exciting things about having this conversation is these conversations are happening around the world, sort of in parallel. I think 5 years ago, they probably weren't happening as much as they are now, but there really is a moment where we have to systematize and figure out, how to do this in a repeatable way.
Yeah, and touching on that point of, there are some, areas that you can quantify and some that you can't. Emily, you mentioned that there are some innovative ways in which, you guys are looking to, quantify some of the benefits. Can you take us through a few of those examples? So you talked, so if maybe you can, provide us with a little bit more, detail around how you've gone about, some of those more innovative techniques. I think you mentioned surveys, using national well-being data. How does that kind of, work in reality?
Yeah, so with the different techniques, there's lots of different data available. I think with an example that is useful for this would be the A303 in England, which is a road that runs through and alongside the World Heritage Site for Stonehenge. So Stonehenge is a UNESCO, a really important asset, and the most important asset in the UK. And a project is going ahead where we will be that motorway will be put underground into a tunnel. So what we're looking at there is what are the well-being benefits that is going to present, and how does that help influence how that project will be designed, and ultimately the decision as to how it would go ahead. So the type of impacts that you're looking at there are looking at sort of the drivers that are passing by. So they're currently getting a welfare benefit of seeing and enjoying the Stonehenge site as they're driving past it, so that will be lost. But then the benefits for those visiting the site and the improved visual amenity of the site itself will be approved. So there's this trade-off between how the well-being will play out for different user groups. So on that project, we're using a technique called Contingent Valuation, and it's essentially a well-being technique that helps us pull together all of those examples. Another example that we can draw on which is a built environment project. So we're working on a high-profile project in London related to the built environment, and we're looking in detail about how we are going to design better office space for people that are working there. So we're looking at certain attributes such as, how good is the ventilation in your office space, how good is the environment that you're working in, what provision is there for you to walk and cycle to work, and those sorts of things. So for that project, we did a stated preference survey, which was a unique bespoke survey where we went out to a sample, and we used like a willingness to pay approach to try and look at the marginal well-being benefit that would be associated to different attributes that you're looking at in the environment. So we can pull all of this together, and what we tend to do on projects is we pull those values into our social value bank, which I mentioned previously, and then we can build up a suite of metrics and values that can tell us what the different well-being outcome is going to be for the different decisions.
Okay, and we're getting a few questions in here as well. So one of the questions is for you, Jonathan. Are there any applications for blockchain in the spaces that you're working in at the moment? And I guess more specifically to this topic, have there been any applications in, in infrastructure, inclusive infrastructure, social value?
There are two places where we're seeing this sort of be top of mind. One is the next generation electric grids. If you think about sort of the traditional generation, transmission and then distribution, as there are more and more distributed energy resources that need to be orchestrated down at the edge of the energy networks, how one creates like a game theoretic optimization rather than a centralized optimization, which really doesn't scale very well. There are a lot of people doing really exciting things in distributed ledgers. The other thing we're seeing a lot, with respect to Bitcoin and the cryptocurrencies is a lot of thought going into next generation data centers from a sustainability perspective. And I think this is something we're going to hear a lot more about over the next few years. As compute continues to explode, we are running these data centers, which require tremendous natural resources, energy, water for cooling, and so forth. And in particular, in situations in which you are basically using that physical resource to create a digital currency, there's a real question as to, from a sustainability and ESG perspective, how ought we be thinking about that? And so I think you're going to see a lot of work coming out from a lot of different people in the next few years about how we could think about a far more sustainable approach to large-scale, hyperscale compute.
Great. And so we've got a few more questions in here as well. So how are social value outcomes? I'll read out the question, and then we can discuss as a group. So how are social value outcomes considered for those who might be displaced as a result of the development project? So, for example, resettlement and rehabilitation in India, and land acquired through compulsory purchase in England. So Uma, I might pass that one on over to you in terms of the social value outcomes considered for those who might be displaced as a result of the development project.
Yeah, this is a very difficult aspect of infrastructure. One of the major issues I see in this is not just the rehabilitation or readjusting people into new lives, but the whole approach to rehabilitation. When rehabilitation happens as a result of an infrastructure project, and the institutions building infrastructure, managing these are infrastructure agencies, then their whole outlook towards rehabilitation is not housing. It doesn't have the focus of housing rehabilitation. It looks at rehabilitation or people sitting in the way of the infrastructure as an impediment, and to remove the impediment, whatever it takes to do, it does. And it extra goes out, it goes an extra mile, goes out of its way, and we provide more for the people who are sitting on infrastructure lands than what we provide as housing solution to the people who are otherwise sitting in a slum. So this kind of disparity that is created is something that's not fair for governments to do. So it divides people into people who are squatting on infrastructure, lands meant for infrastructure, or people who are sitting on lands that are not meant for infrastructure. So that the approach itself is very different. So the sensitivity that goes into it is very different, which is not very correct. But on the other side, when the infrastructure helps rehabilitation of the people, it's on fast track. It provides more than what otherwise they would be getting under a normal scheme. So a lot of people are happy getting that. But what I see is infrastructure is a road or a rail. When I say this kind of infrastructure, and even if it doesn't displace the whole community, it divides, it runs through it. So that itself creates a lot of, suddenly the children are in a shock, the elderly are in a shock. You see your neighbor sitting on the other side of the large street or a highway. That happens. So there are a lot of social issues that get thrown out of these situations. Some are possible to be addressed by infrastructure agencies, but there is a role for many more agencies representing government and not so well representing the government to play a role in better integrating people with the new lives that are created around them. One can only go a little way to alleviate the difficulties that are created. There is a long-term involvement of multi-agencies to settle this.
Okay, great. And I guess conversely, to you, Sarah and Emily, are there similar challenges that you're experiencing in the regions in which you're working at the moment with respect to resettlement and rehabilitation?
Yeah, so I'll just make a comment on the sort of perspective in the UK. So I think the question is, how is social value considered when we're making these compulsory purchase decisions? And I think the answer is that they're not. I think there's a planning process precedes whoever's kind of going to be building that infrastructure. The acquisition and compulsory purchase process is kind of separate to the evaluation process in terms of how we're looking at how impacts are playing out in communities. I think, essentially what happens is property is acquired, and the residents living there are compensated according to the value of their property, and then they relocate. And I think, from a social value perspective, and bearing in mind that we're talking here about well-being, there's a huge amount of impact there that's not being captured. The stress to those individuals, the uncertainty, having to potentially move away from their family, if they're having to relocate and can't relocate in the area that they're being moved from. So I think there is a missed opportunity there to apply social value techniques, wellbeing evaluation, to capture that additional impact and then reflect that in the compensation that is being provided to residents.
Okay, and Sarah, was there anything you want?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, Monica, I think it's a very live topic here at the moment, particularly with regard to gentrification. And the challenge is really, it's really great that we measure social value, but we also need to work harder and become more creative about generating social value. And so when we are thinking about the sort of gentrification, which ultimately, pushes out communities to, experience further disadvantage, how do we actually get creative very, very early in the planning and design phases of a project to start to bring the existing community in so that they are developing the skills, the networks, they're familiar with some of the new businesses that are sort of coming in, some of the new industries and sectors that are likely to be growing, and that we actually, are investing with other partners, community partners, and government, to make sure that those opportunities are actually available. So it's not just, gentrification and you automatically get pushed out, that there is space to actually be part of that process, particularly given the longer time frame of some of these projects.
Right. So we have another question here as well about measuring impacts before and after a project has been commissioned. And I'll hand over to you, Meher, to talk about, if there is an instance where you have sort of measured, say the specific levels of SDGs before a project and then after a project, to actually compare how it's changed. Is that something? Is that sort of data that you have to hand, or are you able to share some experiences around that? You're on mute, Meher.
Yes, being a development bank, it goes without saying, those SDGs and the measure of SDGs, before investing and the monitoring of those, expected results are, key in our intervention. So really, when we design an investment project, and part of, the investment decision is really to see the social impact and the development aspect of our investment. So we need to have a balanced structure between the investment return and the social impact of our investment, especially when it comes to the development and the impact in our member countries. And of course, we set the KPIs in our investment, and both, together, we and our partners along with the government will be following up those KPIs. So, not just, we invest, we set, the KPIs for social development, and after 3 years or 2 years, we'll just monitor that. No. We set KPIs on monthly, if it's not on quarterly and the semi-annually kind of KPIs, and we follow up on those KPIs. And always we try really, to achieve those KPIs. If not, we try to make it up, maybe in the next, quarter and so on. So it's really all about design in the beginning, where we have different components, because as I stressed earlier, in our intervention, always, we try to deal with different partners. Just, to give you an example. For example, we launched an agri fund in West Africa, and this agri fund, we are partnering with the European Commission, Luxembourg government, Rockefeller Foundation, and Bill Gates Foundation, and IFAD. The idea really, it's to empower the small farmers in West Africa with fair trade, because of those small farmers, they deal directly with off-takers. They cannot really, secure good pricing. So with our intervention, we try. we negotiate on behalf of 5,000 small farmers under the umbrella of cooperatives. So we can secure a good price. And the difference in those pricing, it will be invested in the infrastructure of that village. So this is the idea. So we compare if a small farmer will be dealing directly with this, off-taker, and when we act under an umbrella of 5,000 farmers. The difference in terms of profit, part of it, let's say 5% and 10%, will reinvest it in the infrastructure of that village. So the idea, as I said, we deal, for example, we have this fund of agribusiness, and in the same time, we are partnering with KfW for electricity inclusion and to empower those farmers with electricity, really to yield a good quality, product and result. So it's all about design. It's all about really, KPIs, to set the KPIs and how to monitor this. And really, now we are really focusing more and more on including the fintech and blockchain in our approach to well monitor those outcomes and to make sure that our targets in terms of social development are met. Thank you.
Thank you, Maher. So, Jonathan, do you have any sort of before and after examples that you can share from some of your tech-enabled projects?
Yeah, so one thing that's kind of interesting about when you build technology-enabled infrastructure, it's often about taking the data from what's happening in the system and optimizing. Like a lot of what our systems do, we're trying to optimize based upon demand or usage in various different ways. So we have real-time data dashboards for every one of our projects. Our investors actually require us to report out monthly and quarterly on key KPIs. I think that's becoming more and more common. And so we have all the basic, KPIs of like how many, tons of coal was avoided through this virtual power plant, or how many public transit seats were made available, and what was the average time that an individual spent on them. And so you can sort of see in real time, how those are performing. One of the things that we found that's kind of interesting, though, and I'll just mention this, is sometimes people wind up asking for stuff they didn't know they were going to ask for, right? Like, so KPIs like 2-3 years after the project's been implemented, where it's like, hey, can you measure, something else, because it's really important to me for X, Y, and Z reason. And I'll just give you a funny or an interesting example where this came up. We have a project. We backed a technology company that builds robotics for recycling. So it's a camera, it's a computer vision camera combined with a robotic arm that sorts recycling, whereas humans typically do this and can do it much more efficiently and, importantly, much more accurately. And one of the applications for this is actually plastics. It's very hard to sort plastics into the type of very pure bales that can be reprocessed. So we had this project running for a while. We had our dashboard, and there's a camera right there. It's a computer vision camera that's learning over time how to sort this stuff using machine learning. And one of the jurisdictions asked a question of like, can you tell me what's in the trash? There's like, we actually want to go to a stakeholder model where potentially we ask the people who are contributing the most to the problem of plastics going into landfill to bear some of that cost. And so the question, we didn't do it in this form, but the question asked us like, can you tell me how many Starbucks cups there are on the trash? And we actually could have, but that wasn't sort of the objective. We did give them some metrics overall of what types of containers were showing up the most in their trash. They didn't know they wanted that data when we started that project. It's just something that over time, if you are sort of actively managing it and you can sort of understand how the system's being used, there are incremental things you can do.
Right, that's really interesting. And so we've got time for one more question, and I think this is a great question for us to close on. And this one's for you, Sarah. So we have a question here, which is, how do we move from tokenistic social value to something more meaningful that helps to reduce inequalities created or worsened through infrastructure projects? So quite a big question, but I think a good one to end the webinar on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the key thing is starting to get to a point where we value lived experience on an equal footing with technical expertise. That's still such a huge gap in a lot of these projects where it's, the technical sort of overweighs someone's personal and lived experience of a problem or a solution, which often has, access to patterns, nuances, things which you can't really access unless you've lived it. And so there's a big mindset shift for us, as engineers, as designers, as technologists and so on, to actually start to bring that in as a legitimate and credible source of information in all of our sort of design processes and decision making.
Excellent. And I think, that's a close for us. And, I'd like to thank all of our panelists today for joining us and for participating in this really important and incredibly interesting conversation. Thanks to Marie and Patrick as well for joining us earlier on in the webinar, and to our audience for joining us all today and for contributing their questions. So if anybody wants to get in touch with us, we've just got a quick slide that we can flash up with our contact details. Feel free to reach out if you've got any further questions, or if you want to continue the conversation. So Jordana, have you got the slide up? Possibly not. Well, you can always go on the Global Infrastructure Hub website and find us there. So look, thank you, everyone. It was great chatting to you all, and looking forward to next time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. Thanks, everybody.